The League of Women Voters is a people's organization that has worked since 1920 to improve our government and engage all Americans in the decisions that impact their lives. On February 14, 1920, 6 months before the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, the League was formally organized in Chicago as the National League of Women Voters. We operate at national, state, and local levels through more than 800 state and local leagues in all 50 states, as well as the District of Columbia, the Virgin Islands, and Hong Kong. We never endorse or oppose political parties or candidates, but we are political. The centerpiece of the League's efforts remains to expand participation and give a voice to all Americans. We undertake these efforts at all 3 levels of government, engaging in both broad educational efforts as well as advocacy. Our issues are grounded in our respective history of making democracy work for all Americans. Our motto is, democracy is not a spectator sport. We offer our members webinars, conference calls, workshops, other events, and mentorship opportunities throughout the year at the local, regional, state, and national levels. If you are not involved with the League and want to learn more, please speak to me or any of the other members who are here this evening. Our guest speaker this evening is Professor Mira Bernstein from Tufts University. Her talk, Gerrymandering, Why It's More Complicated Than Most People Think, will help us learn about efforts to improve fairness in the election process. Mira holds a research faculty position in the interdisciplinary program of Science, Technology, and Society at Tufts University, where she is a founding member of the Metric, Geometry, and Gerrymandering Group, MGGG, which believes that gerrymandering is a fundamental threat to our democracy. Mira studied mathematics at Yale and was a Churchill Scholar at Cambridge, after which she received her doctorate from Harvard in algebraic geometry. She coordinated a major research team to assess the effects of extending health insurance to a low-income, uninsured population, and she was also the director of a summer program for mathematically talented high school students for over 15 years. With the Supreme Court preparing to hear oral arguments on October 3rd in Gill versus Whitford, a challenge to the redistricting plan passed by Wisconsin's legislature in 2011, this talk is extremely relevant, an extremely relevant look at how voting is affected by gerrymandering. For more information about this important case, which Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg has called perhaps the most important of the upcoming term, there is the Supreme Court of the United States blog where you can find out more information. And also in the New Yorker magazine, the August 8th issue had an interesting piece about a new gerrymandering symposium at Tufts aimed at bringing together people with expertise in the legal, historical, civil rights, and mathematical aspects of redistricting. We will have an opportunity to ask questions following Mira's talk. Now, please join me in welcoming Mira Bernstein.
Thank you. So I have a bunch of microphones I have to turn on, apparently. Let's see. That one works. Is this one? Is this working? Okay. Sorry, too much technology. Is the mic right now okay? Everything okay? I think I don't need this one. I think I'm going to put it here. Is it okay? Yeah, okay, the lapel mic is working. Good. And I should take off this, whatever that is. Wow. Sorry. Okay. Hi. So it's a great honor to be here. The League of Women Voters is, oh, what? Oh, continue. There we go. No, come on. No, don't do this to me. Not right at the talk. Okay. Okay, yeah, so the League of Women Voters has actually been at the forefront. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Is this just going to keep doing? No, I need Wi-Fi because this is Google Google presentation. Okay, we'll keep our fingers crossed. So the League has been at the forefront of fighting gerrymandering for many years. They have been plaintiffs on many anti-gerrymandering cases, so it's a great honor to speak here. So gerrymandering, more complicated than you might think. Can people see the slide? Okay. I don't know if we should maybe turn off those lights in the front. It might be helpful. So, of course, it's in the news a lot these days, gerrymandering. And I don't know if you've seen it, a few weeks ago in the New York Times Magazine, there was an article with the title, "The New Front in the Gerrymandering Wars, Democracy versus Math," which of course made me very upset because I am a founding member of an organization called MGGG, Metric Geometry and Gerrymandering Group, which is all about using math to protect democracy. And somehow they missed that angle. So MGGG is a small group of mathematicians and computer scientists. We organized the big symposium at Tufts that Anne was referring to. We have a bunch more symposia coming up. And our goal is to educate the public about the technical and mathematical aspects of redistricting, but specifically to build a community of people with a quantitative background, mathematicians, computer scientists, statisticians, political scientists, who are knowledgeable about this problem and interested in it, so that when the big round of redistricting comes in 2021 after the census, there'll be something like 8,000 redistrictings happening in the country at the federal, state, local level. And we need to keep an eye on all of them. So we need people sort of on the ground who know how to think about these questions. So that's part of our goals, as well as actually pursuing active research in these mathematics. So let's start with just some basics so we're all on the same page. How do you elect a Congress? Well, you might think you elect a Congress by going to vote. But before that happens, some structural things have to happen. So first, there's the census. The Constitution says you have to enumerate the people every 10 years. So the next one's coming up in 2020, as I said. And you don't just count the population, but you see where the population is. Then there's apportionment, where you say, okay, this state has this many people, this state has this many people, so proportionally to the number of people, we're going to decide how many representatives each state gets in Congress. And then comes the step that I'm going to be talking about, redistricting. But something to note, the Constitution doesn't actually say that you have to do this. The Constitution simply says the state receives a certain number of representatives, and it decides, the state government is supposed to decide, so the state legislature, how these representatives will be chosen. They're supposed to be elected somehow, but exactly how is up to the states. However, for many years now, and there's actually a federal law that says this, the way we do it in the United States is we split the state into what's called single-member districts, which means each district elects one member of Congress, and then people in each district vote and elect their member of Congress. And so now once you've done the districting, then you are ready to vote, right? Then you know who you're voting for, you know who's voting for whom, and how the votes will count, so you're ready to vote. Okay, so the redistricting part is the part I'm interested in. And so a lot of people have a sense that the internet doesn't want you to know how redistricting works now. I do not understand this. I'm on the internet. I apologize. This has never happened to me before. So a lot of people have a sense that things are not going very well in the redistricting process. So we have, unfortunately, redistricting is done by the very people who stand to benefit the most from it, politicians, the actual legislature, which will be elected that way. The US is the only developed country that does it this way. Other countries that have districts have separate commissions that do it. And so, yes, then these politicians draw bizarre-looking districts, and this results in unfair representation. For example, in the case in question in Wisconsin and the Supreme Court, the Republican Party got 49% of the vote, but got 60% of the seats in their state assembly, which seems unfair. So here is most people's intuition of how redistricting should work. So first you have supposed to somehow have honest politicians. I couldn't find a picture to put there. But how you get these honest politicians is an open question. Maybe you don't really need so much honest politicians as politicians with a lot of guidelines and laws to control what they're doing. Maybe a lot of states, well, not a lot, 6 states now have independent redistricting committees, and that seems like a good way to go. Anyway, some people who are maybe slightly less invested in the outcome, who are going to draw compact districts, and this is a map produced by computer scientists of what the US would look like if all the districts in it were sort of maximally nicely shaped. And the technical word for that in the redistricting literature is compact. All those districts have equal population, which is why they're different sizes, but they're sort of nice blobs. And that would lead to something like proportional representation, so that if your party got 49% of the vote, you should get about 49% of the seats, maybe not exactly 49. So this is many people's intuition of what we are aiming for, right? Make the process be done by honest brokers, have them draw compact districts, not this convoluted stuff, and ensure fair proportional representation. Unfortunately, none of this is actually right. Well, a lot is right. So this part is right. This is actually how it works right now in many places, not all, but many. And honest politicians, we definitely want honest people to be doing this. But the fact is, honest politicians will not necessarily draw compact districts. That's not actually what you want. And even if you were to draw compact districts, or even the districts that honest politicians would draw, would not produce proportional representation, almost certainly. So proportional representation isn't going to be the outcome of fixing the gerrymandering system, unfortunately. And many people kind of, I think, working for this cause expect that, okay, once we fix this, take out all the dishonesty, take out the bad shapes, we'll have proportional representation, but that is not the case. That is not how our electoral system works. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. Okay, but first, let's sort of delve into the details here. So here's a toy example. Mathematicians like talking about toy examples. It means examples which are small enough that you can see what's going on. Not realistic, but illustrative. So we have a state called Gerrymandia with 400,000 people, and 45% of them prefer party red and 55% prefer party blue. So red is slightly in the minority. And party red happens to be in charge of the legislature, and it draws 4 districts. And look at the districts that it drew. So they're supposed to draw 4 districts. Oops, sorry, bad formatting. So it drew the districts in such a way that it wins 3 of them and loses the 4th one, even though it's a minority. So is that possible? How would that work? Well, here's a possible picture of Gerrymandia, where every square represents, I think, 500 people. So that's the 400,000 people in Gerrymandia. And here's what the districts that the party drew. Okay, and indeed, you can see that, let's see, do I have this? No. That in fact, all the districts except for District 4 have majority red. So how did this happen, right? How can you make it so that a minority party gets 3/4 of the districts? Well, so there are standard techniques for this. So the first part is called packing. So if you look at District 4, right there, shadow, you see that it's almost entirely blue. Remember, the red party is trying to disenfranchise the blue party voters, trying to get as many districts for itself as possible. So what it does is it says, we can't make something with no blue districts. That's not going to work. We have to have a blue district. But okay, that one blue district will pack as many blue voters in it as possible so that they don't then go and ruin our plans in other districts. So that's called packing, when you pack voters from an opposing party into a district so that they win that district, but they win it with so many votes to spare that could have been used somewhere else that those votes are wasted. Okay, and then the rest of what it's doing is, okay, we've packed a bunch of blue voters into District 4, and now we just want to make sure that the remaining blue voters don't form the majority of any district, where they could. I mean, you could easily draw districts such that the remaining blue voters, not in District 4, would be a majority, but instead you split them up between districts. That's called cracking. So packing and cracking, a nice alliterative phrase, is the way gerrymandering works, basically always. Those are the techniques of the gerrymanderers. Alternatively, here's what you could have done if you were maybe being a little more honest. You could have drawn nice square districts, and you can see that in this case, party red would get half the districts and party blue would get half the districts, which is about as close as you can get to 45-55 with 4 districts. So this looks both a nicer picture, more neutral, and more fair. So are politicians really this shameless? Of course they are. You all know that. These are some actual districts from Texas in the 2000s. Really. Okay, let's just talk a little bit about history. How many people knew that gerrymandering originated right here in Massachusetts? Yes, we have something to be proud of. So Elbridge Gerry, he was Gerry, not Jerry. Somewhere along the line, the pronunciation changed. But Elbridge Gerry was the governor of Massachusetts in 1810. Later, he was the founding father, actually. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and later on, he went on to be President Madison's vice president. So he had quite an illustrious career, but this is what he's mostly remembered for, poor guy. So in 1810, for the first time since the founding of the United States, all 3 parts of the Massachusetts state government, so the governor's mansion and both parts of Massachusetts Congress, went to the same party. Before then, they had always been split, and it was always close. But in this case, they all went to Gerry's party, and so, and 1810 was a census year, a redistricting year. So they said, let's make sure that we keep this advantage, right? Because they were sick of it always alternating. They had elections every year in those days, not every 2 years, and then just every year it would fluctuate. And so Gerry carved out a little piece of Massachusetts there. Basically what he did was, at the time, actually, it's kind of interesting, the history is interesting, there were actually no districts at all. The way it worked is that counties had representatives, and the larger counties had more representatives, and smaller counties had fewer representatives. But there was no, the politicians didn't actually draw districts at all. The counties were neutral things that were historically determined, like old divisions, and just every county had some number of representatives. That's for the Massachusetts Senate, and the Massachusetts House was just by town. Towns had representatives. But the problem was that in Essex County, well, from Gerry's point of view, this was a problem. In Essex County, there were 5 representatives, and the majority of Essex County was Federalist, which is the other party. So he was from a party called Democratic Republicans, which is very confusing to us today. But that's one party, the Democratic Republicans, which are sometimes called the Democrats and sometimes called the Republicans, but that's the same party. So I'll call them the Republicans. So he was from the Republican Party. The Federalist Party had a majority in Essex County, and just the way they elected people, if you had a majority in the county, then all of the representatives from that county were yours. And so all 5 were Federalist. And there were other counties where the majority was Republican, and so all 6 candidates were Republican, or all 4 representatives ended up being Republican. But he said, let's split the county, because the Federalists live on the coast, the Republicans live further inland, as it happened, because the Federalists were like the urban party and the Republicans were the rural party. And now, if we split it, the Federalist part will get 3 representatives, and they will all be Federalists, and that outside part will get 2 representatives, and they'll all be Republican. And he did this actually not just to that county, but to all the Federalist counties. Now, in some sense, what he was doing was actually more proportional representation, right? He was saying, if a county is majority Federalist, why should all 5 of its representatives be Federalist? Let's split it so that if it's approximately 60-40, then the representatives will be 60-40. The problem is, he only did it to the Federalist counties. He didn't do it to the Republican counties. So he left the Republican majority counties intact, but he split the Federalist counties. Anyway, that's what Gerry did. And somehow, even though you can describe what he did as quite sort of clearly nefarious and partisan without saying anything about shapes, what people latched onto was the shape. So that shape was then satirized in a Federalist newspaper, the Boston Gazette, And they said, look at that horrible shape. It's some kind of monster. And they have this long discussion. Is it a dragon? Is it a basilisk? And they finally decide, no, it is a salamander. And so they give it some wings and some claws. And so they call it the Gerrymander, Gerry's salamander. Okay? So somehow, again, the idea is somehow that we focus on the shape, even though the other things that the other counties that Gerry split, he split in a nicer way. He just split them down the middle to achieve the same result. And even if the shape hadn't been like this, you could still argue that what he did was very clearly a partisan maneuver. But somehow the shape was what got people like really, really riled up. And of course, that's what got them riled up. But compared to our modern gerrymanders, that looks friendly by comparison. So, okay, but let's sort of dig a little bit more into shapes versus partisan maneuvering. Okay, so let's go back to our toy example. So this is exactly what we saw before. I'm just putting it again on the picture. So we have this horrible, weird shapes that were drawn in order to engineer those kinds of districts. But that's assuming that Gerrymandia looks like this. What if Gerrymandia looked like that? That's the same number of red and blue squares, just differently arranged. And actually, if you think of, I mean, here I'm just saying red and blue. I'm not really thinking about Republicans and Democrats. But if you think about Republicans and Democrats, this is actually quite realistic, right? You have a Democratic city in the middle surrounded by Republican countryside. Okay, so let's say Gerrymandia looks like this, and we divide it very nicely. And let's look at the percentages. And guess what? Those very percentages that we really disliked before, that we thought, oh, those came from the horrible shapes, actually here, that's what you get when you just divide it completely naturally. So you divided it completely naturally, but it's manifestly unfair. Now, if you're the blue party, and you're in charge of redistricting, you look at this and you're like, okay, wait, we tried to do the honest thing, but this is obviously wrong. So let's just adjust it a little bit. And now, if you do it this way, then it becomes right again. Then you have 50-50. You just changed like a little bit where the blues and the reds are, and now everything's balanced again. But then, of course, the red party is going to come and say, you're gerrymandering. Why did you make that ugly thing? Why didn't you do this nice thing? Why did you have this ugly maneuver? You're maneuvering, you're gerrymandering. And they sort of are gerrymandering, except they're gerrymandering for fairness. Right? So this idea that neutrality means fairness, already in this toy example, you see it's not true. So this makes you wonder, if we're going for fairness, why are we talking about shape at all? Like, why should we even care about shape? So this is a map from the Washington Post, and it's, you see these kinds of maps a lot. They show you all the congressional districts in the United States, and they're coloring them by how badly shaped they are for some way of measuring bad shapes. There are many, actually, ways of measuring the goodness and badness of shapes, and my colleague Moon Duchin at MGGG thinks a lot about that geometry. But let's just say you picked some way, and some of those things are very convoluted looking. And the Washington Post publishes this and says, look how gerrymandered America is, look how horrible everything is. And those words, bizarre, tortured, irrational, those aren't from the Washington Post, those are from the Supreme Court, talking about various districts and saying how horrible they are. And in contrast, we have this map that we saw earlier with the nice districts. But the question is, why do we like this better? Why is this better? Like, why do we even care about the shape of districts? And it was not till I was working on the subject for a while that I even asked myself this philosophical question. So let's think about that. Why do we care about shapes? Well, okay, by the way, compactness, right, is the word used in the redistricting context for a nice shape. So possible answer number one, nice shapes are good for their own sake. So here's how you could motivate that. You could say, well, why do we have geographic representation in the first place? Why don't we do it like many places in Europe where you vote for a nationwide party and then you have a nationwide party representing you? Well, the idea is that you have a community that has its common interests and common concerns and common issues. And then you have a representative that comes from that community who represents that community in a local way, in an accountable way. People know him or her, he or she knows the people. So basically, and if you think of it that way, then clearly you don't want an octopus, right? You want something that's a community, some natural shape, right? So that's one reason why we might choose to care about shape. The problem with this is that real communities are often not compact. So here are some examples. The earmuffs district. These districts are so famously badly shaped that they have names that their enemies call them. So there you go, the earmuffs district. That's in Chicago. Terrible shape. Like on the left, it goes just along a highway. What the heck is going on there? Clearly something nefarious is at work. But actually, no. Nothing nefarious is at work there. What they're trying to do is unite a community. So the two earmuffs on the right, the two like big blobs, those are two Hispanic neighborhoods in Chicago. And each one of them on its own isn't big enough to be a district. But together they are. And they're both Hispanic neighborhoods, so the idea is maybe they share some concerns, and you want them to be in the same district. But if you might ask, why did they make the head of the earmuffs? Why not just connect them this way? Well, if you connect them this way, you separate an African American community in half. So if you have sort of African American community here, Hispanic community here, you can't do, if you do this, then these are cut off. If you do this, these are cut off. So what instead you do is you do this. So actually, there's a very good and valid explanation for that district from the point of view of a district is supposed to be a community. The second district, the ribbon of shame, it no longer exists after the last round of California redistricting. You can't even see it on the map probably, but it's just this green thing that goes along the coast, thin thing along the coast. So again, if you think of districts as communities, there's a perfectly natural explanation for that. People who live on the coast, coastal property owners, they're a community. They have their own concerns, right? Whatever their concerns might be, maybe you think, whatever. They have issues that they care about. If you want representatives to represent people with common interests and issues, then it makes sense to give them a district. And finally, cities. Obviously, a city is a kind of political community, right? Because cities have their own laws, their own political structure. So, in fact, many state laws and guidelines for redistricting say you should try not to cut apart cities. But cities are not compact. Boston is a horrible shape. So, and if you look at the traditional redistricting principles, which is something, it's sort of the set of principles that are considered things you want to look for in redistricting. Different states have different ones of these principles as laws. So some states will have all of them, some states will have only some. But as a whole, these principles are recognized by the courts as sort of the set of legitimate goals of redistricting. Well, so equal in population, that's mandatory. But the Constitution says that. But then you have contiguous, so they shouldn't be split apart. Okay, maybe logical, and compact, so that's the nice shape. But then you have preserve political boundaries and preserve communities of interest. Those are separate principles. They don't follow from compactness, and in fact, they're often very much at odds with compactness. And so often states have to balance compactness with preserving communities of interest. Those are different principles. So if you thought that compactness is a way of achieving some kind of coherence of the district, that's just not the case in many, many places. So if there's, I think I have three main kind of take-home messages from this talk. And here's the first one, that you will hear people say, we should just have an algorithm that draws the most compact possible districts and it'll be great. And no, this is actually not the answer. And most sort of people that I've talked to in legal scholars and political scientists and historians will tell you, no, that's not it. Because this ignores all the subtlety of communities. And in fact, when politicians draw districts, I'm talking about honest politicians, not corrupt ones, they pay a lot of attention to community. And this is just sort of blobs on the page. This doesn't fulfill the whole purpose of geographic representation. So this is not the answer. Okay, so that was one reason why we might care about compactness. that compactness is somehow synonymous with community, except it isn't. Okay, so here's another reason why we might care about compactness. And this is, many people will sort of say this after thinking about it a little. They'll say, well, compactness is like a proxy for neutrality, right? If I see a district that looks like an octopus, I think this was drawn by design. Somebody had some purpose, and it probably wasn't a good purpose. But if I see a blob, I think, okay, whatever this blob is, nobody is trying to fulfill some kind of nefarious intent this way, right? So compact districts are drawn in a neutral way, which supposedly makes them more fair. So the problem with this, there are two problems. One is compactness is not necessarily neutral, and the other is neutrality is not necessarily fair. We saw a little bit of the neutrality isn't fair with the second example in Gerrymandia, right, where you drew nice neutral districts and it didn't come out fair. The first one is actually a really interesting one, and I think that it's quite possible that, back in the 19th century, compact actually did mean neutral. But with modern technology, you can draw districts very, very carefully that are not at all neutral and not at all fair, but that still look compact, right? In other words, so how do politicians draw districts? How does it actually work? The way it works is a politician has a map where all the census blocks, so census blocks are like little tiny bits of neighborhoods that the census delineates, which are neutral. The census just delineates them. And for every census block, it has all the information, like how many people live there, also their demographics, their race and age, and also they have partisan data, so they have their election data, right? So for every little neighborhood on the map, like 1,000 people. And now they can click on the census block and say, okay, this one goes to this district, this one goes to this district, this one goes to this district. That's how they draw the districts. And so as they draw the districts, they get immediate updates of how many people does this district have? Does it need more people? That's great. That's as it should be. But also, how Republican this district is, how Democratic it is, how white it is, how Hispanic it is, how black it is. And also they get this compactness scores. So like how nice does it look? And so you can very carefully engineer it. This actually isn't math. Like they don't do this with any kind of sophisticated math. They just do it by trial and error, as far as I know. But you can very carefully engineer it so you get the results that you want, but the district still looks pretty decent, right? So it used to be that to achieve your nefarious goals, you had to draw something complicated. You don't have to anymore. So compact does not mean neutral. It could be hiding all sorts of things. So neutral does not necessarily mean fair. Let's talk a little more about that. So let's talk about the great state of Massachusetts. Massachusetts is a reliably blue state, but that doesn't mean that all Massachusetts voters are Democrats. In fact, a large percentage of our voters, a large minority of our voters, 30 to 40% of our voters are usually Republican, let's say in Democratic elections. But our representatives, our congressional representatives, have been Democrats for a long, long time, right? So I have actually heard it said, like I went to a law conference where there was an anti-gerrymandering activist who said, well, clearly Massachusetts is gerrymandered because they're 30% Republican, but they have, out of their 9 representatives, they should have 3 Republican representatives. How come they don't? They all have all Democratic representatives. Clearly, that's Democratic gerrymandering. So here's my question. Is it in fact the case, is there evidence that Massachusetts congressional districts are gerrymandered against Republicans? So to answer that question, we have to look carefully at the demographics of Massachusetts. So look at the graph on the left. So that is from 2000, Bush v. Gore, our favorite election. And Bush got 32% of the vote. Sorry, am I blocked? Okay, is there anything I can do to make this better for you? Okay. So Bush got 32% of the vote. Here's what that graph represents. So the horizontal axis, the x-axis, is the population density. Forget the log. So to the right is cities, to the left is countryside. The vertical axis represents percentage of people that voted Republican. So up is Republican, down is Democratic. Okay? So what can you see from this graph? Well, some things are exactly as you expect, right? Here you have the Democratic cities and the Republican countryside, right? So one thing you can see is that, yes, cities are more Democratic, but have more Democrats than the countryside. But we knew that already. Here's another thing you can see, though. If you look, oh, sorry, I didn't say the most important thing. Each dot represents a precinct. So a precinct is like a place with one polling station. That's the smallest unit, population unit, for which we have voting information. Because, of course, the ballot is secret, so we don't have voting information for individuals. But each precinct reports at the election, you know, in our precinct, 70% of voters voted Democrat, 30% voted Republican. So each dot is a precinct. So think neighborhood. Each dot is a neighborhood, small neighborhood. So look at what you can see. There are a lot of Republicans in Massachusetts, but almost none of them live in majority Republican neighborhoods. To be a majority Republican neighborhood, you have to be above the 50% line, right? And there's almost nothing there. There are very, very few neighborhoods which are over 50% Republican. If you're just below that line, you're a neighborhood that contains a whole lot of Republicans, but in your neighborhood, the Democrats outnumber the Republicans. So in order to make a majority Republican district, it would have to be assembled out of those neighborhoods. To be majority Republican, it would have to contain districts which are, neighborhoods that are above the line. But the neighborhoods above the line, there are very few of them. In particular, there isn't 1/9 of them. There's simply not enough not enough neighborhoods in Massachusetts that are majority Republican to build a majority Republican district out of them. They're just not there, right? Even though we have Republicans, they're all surrounded by Democratic neighbors, and so any district you form, they'll be outnumbered. This is 2000, so I haven't actually looked at the 2012, 2016, but I'm sure it's pretty similar. So this means that not only are Massachusetts districts probably not gerrymandered, but that if you tried very hard as a Republican to gerrymander them so that you would have a Republican district, you probably couldn't succeed anyway. So no amount of pro-Republican gerrymandering would allow you to create a Republican district in Massachusetts. Now, this is just congressional districts. The local districts, state assembly districts, that's a different ballgame because Massachusetts voters are often more Republican in the state elections than in national elections, so that's a different story. But in congressional districts, that's it. So neutral, not neutral, it doesn't matter. It just, you can't get a fair result for Massachusetts Republicans. If by fair you mean proportional, right? If there's a third of them, they should have a third of their representatives. You cannot get that. There's nothing you can do. So here's a toy example of the same thing. Here's a state which is 40% red, 60% blue, divided up into totally neutral districts, but notice that in every district is 60% blue, 40% red, so all the districts end up blue. Not fair to the red voters. What can you do? So are Massachusetts congressional districts gerrymandered? No, they're not. Okay, here's a second example, a more kind of controversial one maybe. Florida, our favorite state during our favorite election of 2000. Sorry? Yeah, that's a good point. I never thought about that. But actually, many, many states look like that if you look at that graph. So let's talk about that graph. Well, first let's talk about the results of the election in Florida in 2000. We're not talking about the presidential election. We're talking about the congressional election. And, but we're using the presidential vote to measure sort of partisanship. The reason we do that, by the way, is that a lot of congressional districts, there's the person who's running is often running unopposed, so you don't actually know what the votes would have been. So a lot of times political scientists use this as a proxy, and it's a good proxy. So, okay. So Florida was basically evenly split, 50-50 in 2000, as we know, famously very evenly split between Republicans and Democrats, but Republicans won 65% of the seats in their congressional delegation. So is Florida gerrymandered for Republicans? So let's look at that graph. So that looks very different from Massachusetts, right? For one thing, there's plenty of places where Republicans are the majority. You can draw lots of Republican districts. That's not a problem. Also, you can see the whole sort of Democrats are basically only in the cities, and Republicans are both in the cities and in the countryside. Also kind of an interesting thing. And a lot of states look like that. New York looks like that. Texas looks like that. Many, many states have this Florida-looking shape. It's not just because it's Florida. But here's the interesting thing that you don't notice till you stare at this for a while, which is that see how far down it goes and see how far up it goes. So you can see that the neighborhoods go all the way down to 0%. That means Florida has lots and lots of neighborhoods where everybody voted for Gore. Nobody voted for Bush. Well, maybe they voted for Nader. But anyway, nobody voted for Bush. Okay? So, right, so that's what it means that it goes all the way down. But on the upside, Florida doesn't have almost any neighborhoods where everybody voted for Bush. In every neighborhood where the majority of people voted for Bush, there was a considerable number of Democrats. And that, too, is the same. And this, I didn't know this till I started staring at these things. The same all over the country. Even like Texas, Wyoming, even the most Republican states that we think of as very, very Republican, they don't go up to 100%. There are no purely Republican neighborhoods. There's purely Democratic neighborhoods, and there are no purely Republican neighborhoods. Even the most Republican neighborhoods in Texas have 20% Democrats. There's sort of something like tops out at 80%. Kind of amazing, right? So what is first of all, that's just interesting to know, I think, on its own. But second of all, what does that tell us about redistricting? Well, remember the packing problem, right? Democrats here are concentrated in places where they're wasting tons of votes because they're like 100% voting for Democrats. Meanwhile, Republicans are not wasting as many votes, and there are all these Democratic votes being wasted in the Republican neighborhoods, right? The 20% of the Democrats, their votes go nowhere. But in the Democratic neighborhoods, there are no Republicans to waste their votes. They're just purely Democratic. So as a result, this creates an imbalance, a bias towards Republicans. And so let's see, how will we check? On the other hand, there's also Republican gerrymandering. We know that. We know that because we have transcripts of, people in Florida and elsewhere saying awful, awful things, of legislators, behind closed doors, saying that they want to squeeze out as much, Republican vote as possible and totally disempower the Democrats. So how do you know how much of the bias is due to that and how much is due to demography? Well, one thing you can do is do computer simulations with random districts. So what you do is you say, I'm going to run my computer to produce a pretty good districting plan. I'm not trying to, this isn't the same as like I'm trying to produce the best possible districting plan as some people want to do, like algorithmic districting. No, not that. I'm just going to produce a pretty good one where the districts are reasonably compact and the laws are satisfied, right? And all the districts are equal population. Except I'm going to do that not once, I'm going to do it 1,000,000 times. The computer can do that, right? So I'm going to just randomly sample from the space of all possible good plans. And then I'll see what happens in those plans. And in those plans, Republicans get between 56 and 68% of the seats, even though no Republicans get 49% of the vote. They get a lot more than half the seats. And depending on the plan. So in some plans they get 56, in some plans they get 68, mostly they get in between. The average is 61. So then you say, what about 65, which was the actual plan? Well, that's a little higher than average, so maybe there's something to be suspicious of, but it's not terribly higher than average. It's not out of the bounds of possibility. So it's actually quite indeterminate whether this was due to demography or due to gerrymandering. And here's a toy example of that. So here we have red voters are less than half in this picture, but notice that the blue voters are packed, naturally packed, in the left two districts. And so once you see how the election goes, red voters win the red party wins the majority of districts, even though they're a minority of voters, not because the districts are ugly, just because of how the voters live. So again, with Florida, unclear. Florida in 2000, sort of, on the one hand, it's higher than average, but on the other hand, it's not within, it's sort of within the margin of error, so it could be demography. That's a very complicated problem, right? So this is one of the things the Supreme Court has to face against, where, and this is the, while there is undoubtedly Republican gerrymandering going on, and some Democratic gerrymandering, but currently mostly Republican, just as it happens, they always say, the legislators, when threatened, when challenged, always say, oh, it's just demography, Democrats pack themselves. And how do you disentangle which is which? Okay, so, but back to shapes, right? So compact districts are not necessarily neutral. Neutral does not necessarily mean fair. Compactness for its own sake is questionable. So where does that leave us? Well, that leaves us with yet one more question. So I'm going to challenge one more thing that you probably think is obvious, which is, what does fair mean? So until now, we've kind of been assuming that we know what fair means, right? And, well, I guess if you disagreed, you didn't have a chance to say it, but most of the time when I ask people in lectures like this, what does fair mean? Like, do you think it's fair if Republicans are 30% of the population of Massachusetts, they should have a third of the representatives? People say yes. So people think that fair is basically proportional. On the other hand, Justice Kennedy, who's actually going to be the deciding justice in this case, thinks that he doesn't know what fairness means. So he says, this is from 2004, which is the second most recent partisan gerrymandering case. So in partisan gerrymandering calendar, this is very recent. This is basically the last time he had a chance to say anything about the matter. This is what he said. The parties have not shown us and have not been able to discover statements of principled, well-accepted rules of fairness that should govern districting. In other words, he's saying, I don't know what fair means. And you might say, Justice Kennedy, what are you talking about? Don't we all know what fair means? Like, why not just say if it deviates too much from proportionality, then it's not fair? Like, isn't that obvious? Why are you doing this? So this is what most people think. So problem 2, the Supreme Court won't accept it, and we'll get to that. But the main problem, maybe you could convince the Supreme Court to accept it. The main problem, as I said earlier, way back at the beginning, is that it doesn't actually, in our system of elections, where you divide the state up into districts and each district elects one representative, proportionality is, and let's say you did everything completely fairly, proportionality is not only guaranteed, it's an extremely unlikely outcome. So in our kind of elections, you get what's called the winner's bonus. So let me talk about this curve for a sec. This is a very important curve. So on this graph, the x-axis, so the horizontal axis, is the percentage of votes that a party got. Doesn't matter which party, let's say Democrats. So here's the percentage of the votes the Democrats got. And this is the percentage of the seats that the Democrats got as a result. Okay? So it makes sense. If Democrats got 0% of the votes, if Democrats got no votes, they should get no seats. So it should start sort of at 0-0. And if Democrats got 100% of the votes, they should get 100% of the seats. It should end at 1-1 or 100-100, right? And that thick line in the middle is the line of proportionality. That's the line where the percent of votes you get is the percent of seats you get. That's the line that most people think is fair. So most people would like it to be the case. In fact, I would like it to be the case. It's just not the case. That if you have elections that are run totally fairly and there's no demographic disadvantage and there's no gerrymandering, then each election would correspond to a point, right, near that line. So each election gives you a point, right? And each election you can see how many votes did Democrats get, how many seats did Democrats get. Each election gives you a point, and you were hoping that the points would lie on that line, but they don't. That's just not how it is. So they usually lie, exactly where they lie is a matter of uncertainty. But it seems to be that they lie on some kind of curve that goes more steeply in the middle. And in fact, if you think about it, let's say that elections usually lie along that curve. Or it could be a different curve, could be this curve. That would actually be fair. There's nothing unfair about this, right? Because what this is saying is that if Democrats get a little bit more than half the votes, they get a lot more than half the seats. But if Republicans get a little more than half the votes, in other words, if Democrats get a little less, then Republicans get a lot more than half the seats. So it's perfectly symmetrical. It's just saying that whoever wins gets more seats than the percentage of votes by which they won. So if elections followed a curve like that, that would be fair. If elections followed a curve like that, that would also be fair. If elections followed any of these curves, any one of them, that would be fair. At least fair in the sense that it doesn't privilege one party over the other. Now, it seems to be that they mostly follow a curve like this. And you might say, well, I don't like this. Like that, I mean, it's fair in the sense that it doesn't disadvantage Republicans over Democrats, but it's just not fair in the sense that I don't like it working this way. I don't want a party that got 53% of the vote to get 65% of the seats. I don't like that. So here's the thing though. Along with people saying that they really like proportionality, people also often say that they really like close competitive elections, right? We love that, right? We say, oh yes, what we want, our politicians draw safe districts, that's bad. We want competitive districts. But think about what competitive districts does, right? If you have competitive districts, then if the total amount of the vote is just a little bit over 50%, then probably a lot of those districts also went over 50%. And so you basically now won a lot of those districts. And if it's just under 50%, you lost a lot of those districts. So you actually get a curve much like that, right? And that begins to get to the concept of why it is that our system of elections, with its sort of winner-take-all, produces a winner's bonus. And which of these curves it is really depends on how the votes are spread out, like whether there's very extreme, people have very extreme preferences, or most voters are clustered in the middle. So there's sort of no single curve that's the curve of justice. The only thing that needs to be fair about a curve is that it's symmetrical, right? Other than that, these are just curves that would occur in different scenarios of how the voters are spread out. And this is separate from the demographic advantage of one party over another. This is just, whether people are well mixed or not well mixed. So that means that from the results of a single election, like if you say Republicans got 51% of the votes but 65% of the seats, you can't tell if that was gerrymandering or not. A single election tells you nothing, because it could lie, that result is not proportional, but it could lie on one of these curves and be perfectly fair. So where does that leave us? That leaves us with a very complicated situation, right? I think, if you go back to my first slide where people know what should happen with gerrymandering, people think they know what should happen if we fix gerrymandering, we've basically now gotten rid of all of that, right? We've gotten rid of nicely shaped districts, we've gotten rid of proportionality. So what do we do? I don't have a good answer to that. But let me tell you a little bit about how the court thinks about it. Well, I have some answers which we'll get to later, but so the court, actually, you know what? Well, basically, I think the court understands this. So the court thinks of proportionality as a legitimate fairness goal to strive for. In other words, it's saying, hey, if your idea of fairness is that proportionality curve, go for it. Sure, fine. But you can't force it on other people. You can't say if it's off that curve, it's unfair. And so they very, very clearly say proportionality is not required by the Constitution. And they're basically right. They're basically right. When I started looking at this, I was like, oh, this is just some weird legal thing that, the lawyers think in their own special weird legal ways, and there's some legal reason. But actually, they're just right empirically. Okay, so a little bit about what's at stake in this case. So this is now a little bit legal stuff. So the history of partisan gerrymandering in the Supreme Court is actually, there have been only 3 partisan gerrymandering cases in the Supreme Court ever total. This is now the 4th. In contrast, racial gerrymandering, which is when you gerrymander to deprive a racial group of voting power, has a huge long history in the Supreme Court because we have the Voting Rights Act, which basically explicitly makes that illegal. There is no law that explicitly makes partisan gerrymandering illegal. The only thing that could make it illegal is if they decide it violates the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. So in the very first partisan gerrymandering case in 1986, the court said the following. They said, okay, first of all, political motivation in redistricting is perfectly legal and constitutional. If it weren't, the Constitution wouldn't have given that power to the state legislatures. So it's legal. Now, if it's excessive and discriminatory, then it stops being legal. But how much is too much? Essentially, the court said, we don't know. But what they said was, in order to be too much, it has to have intentional discrimination. So there has to be an intent to disempower the other party. That's not a problem. We have, for many, many cases, we have lots of evidence that there was intent. And there has to be a discriminatory effect. And how do you measure a discriminatory effect? So it has to be something that consistently degrades that group of voters' influence in the political process as a whole. And the court basically said That doesn't mean you lost an election. That's not consistently degrading. That doesn't mean that there's evidence of packing and cracking. That doesn't mean that you won the majority of the votes but got a minority of the seats. None of that is evidence of something which consistently degrades your influence in the political process as a whole. So what is such evidence? We don't know. And so after 1986, this is quite amazing. From 1986 until 2016, there has been no partisan gerrymandering case in court which succeeded. In federal court. There are state ones because states have laws, but in federal court. In other words, the Supreme Court in 1986 gave such a vague and high standard that there has not been a single case until this Wisconsin case where the court said, yes, we see evidence of unconstitutional partisan gerrymandering. Because what the Supreme Court said was evidence, well, they didn't say what evidence was. They just said what it wasn't, and what it wasn't is basically everything. So there were two more cases, close succession, 2004 and 2006, and the court continued to reject every standard offered. So this is when mathy people got involved, and they started offering some kinds of quantitative standards, and the court said, no, we don't like that. But they liked this idea of symmetry and asymmetry that I was talking about, how, we don't know what the curve should look like, but it has to be symmetric. And they kind of encouraged political scientists and mathematicians to keep thinking in that direction. And so now people have been thinking in that direction, and they came up with this standard called the efficiency gap, which you've probably read about if you've read anything about gerrymandering. The popular press, the way it wants you to think about it is there's now this new great standard, the efficiency gap, and it's going to solve all our problems. Not quite true. But anyway, one reason possibly that this new case, Gill v. Whitford, succeeded, this is an old slide, which is why it says Whitford v. Gill. Before it went to the Supreme Court, it was Whitford v. Gill, but when it was appealed to the Supreme Court, it got flipped. So now it's Gill v. Whitford. Okay, so forgive that. It's Gill v. Whitford. So that's the case that the Supreme Court is about to hear. And that was the first time that a federal district court, the first time basically ever, ruled that there was unconstitutional partisan gerrymandering. And so they used this tool called the efficiency gap, which its authors say captures in a single tidy number all of the packing and cracking that go into a districting plan. So they're basically touting it as this magical formula that will solve all your problems, that will measure exactly how gerrymandered a district is. So I think I don't have time to go through all the details about the efficiency gap, but you can read them in pretty much any newspaper. So how it works is it looks very intuitive. It sounds very, very good. But when you dig into the math, what it actually ends up amounting to, after you look at the way it's described, it sounds very, very logical. And really, you can read any newspaper article and you will see the description. It's math that's simple enough that newspapers put it in. The hope is that it's simple enough for the Supreme Court. I think mathematicians and political scientists don't have a very high opinion of the quantitative level of sophistication of Supreme Court justices. I think they're wrong, actually. I think the justices are actually quite sophisticated. But anyway. But if you look at what the math actually shows, then in order to fulfill the efficiency gap standard, you need to have the difference in seat share between the parties. This is not right. It should be half the difference. This is a mistake in the slide. Difference in vote share should be half the difference in seat share. So forget that, just look at the numbers below. No, that's also not right. Yes. Right. Oh, sorry, that was proportionality. So for proportionality, if the vote split is 50-50, the seat split would be 50-50. If the vote split is 60-40, the seat split would be 60-40. That's kind of what people think is fair. For the efficiency gap, if the vote split is 50-50, the seat split should be 50-50. But if the vote split is 60-40, the seat split should be 70-30. So the efficiency gap actually not only allows deviation from proportionality, it mandates it. And it mandates a very particular deviation from proportionality. Because 60-40 would be wrong, but 80-20 would also be wrong. So the efficiency gap prescribes a particular deviation from proportionality, which basically contradicts everything I've been telling you. Right? and I'm right and they're wrong. No. So what I've been telling you is that, right, the actual particular seat vote curve, the curve of justice, you can't actually pin down a particular one. And they're claiming to pin down a particular one, but there's really no reason to think that it's this one. And you know, they have some argument that maybe this is the one that has been seen in US elections, but there's actually very little data about that. And then they say, well, our approach proves that this is the right one. But again, you can take their approach and tweak it a little bit, and it'll sound just as logical, and will give you a different curve. So mostly, I think what they're doing is doing something really, really simple that the justices, they think, will like, slipping under the rug all the complications that really go into it, and hoping nobody will notice. That's actually not quite the case. So here. In fact, the court in Wisconsin was aware of the limitations of the efficiency gap. Again, the justices are actually very mathematically sophisticated, I was happy to discover. They knew all the problems, and they said, well, first of all, there are enough safeguards within the law that if, for example, if the vote split is 60-40 and the seat split is 60-40, well, you could never say that there was intention to gerrymander there. So the law, since remember you need intention and effect, the law wouldn't actually consider that gerrymandering, so there's these safeguards. Plus, they didn't actually really base their decision on the efficiency gap at all. They based it on a bunch of factors. They said an efficiency gap is just one of these factors. And then the lawyers who are appealing the case to the Supreme Court, if you read their appeal, they've actually backed off the efficiency gap a little bit, and they're saying, well, we just want the court to adopt the standard of partisan symmetry. Efficiency gap is one way of measuring it. There are other ways of measuring. Just please do something. And even I, as a mathematician, to whom I'm actually kind of offended at how bad this measure is mathematically, I would rather the Supreme Court adopted it than nothing, because it will rule out the worst gerrymanders. But I would more rather the Supreme Court didn't adopt it, and maybe didn't even adopt any particular measure necessarily, but just said, this is approximately the kind of thing we want to measure. We'll try a few different measures for now, and if they all give a bad result, then yes, it's a gerrymander. Meanwhile, please look for better measures. You know, mathematicians and political scientists. And there is precedence for the court saying something like this, for endorsing a general idea of how to measure something, and then saying, we'll use the imperfect tools we have right now, but we'll adopt better tools as they come along. Right, we need the court to do something. So, in summary, nothing is simple. Bizarre shapes are not necessarily bad. Compact shapes are not necessarily good. Some things that look like gerrymandering are just demography, but not everything is just demography, so how do you separate between them? And simply deviation from proportionality is not evidence of unfairness. And we haven't even started talking about race, which is a whole separate can of worms. Racial gerrymandering is a very complicated issue. So, what are we doing? So, we are trying to come up with better standards, both for fairness and for compactness. And then, remember this example where I talked about Florida? How can you tell whether it's demography or gerrymandering, where you produce samples of many random plans? So that actually, I said it like it was easy. I said computers can do that. It's actually very, very hard because the space of all possible plans is enormous. It's just astronomical. And so simply finding the ones that are decent within it, if you just kind of look at random, you'll look forever. So that is actually very, very complicated algorithms. And our group believes, and I think most of the mathematically oriented people I've ever talked to believe that this is the future of fighting partisan gerrymandering. To design good algorithms that can produce random plans. Not algorithms that can produce the best possible plans. That's the wrong way to go, because redistricting is an art as much as a science. For the actual plan, you want someone to fine-tune it, a human to fine-tune it. But to produce these random plans so that you can basically see what's the realm of the possible. And just to give you an example, here's one team that did this at Duke. They did this for North Carolina. So, and I think it just sort of makes everything just crystallize. So here is the histogram shows you there are thousands of plans they produced. And it shows how many seats Democrats got in would get under each of those plans. That's the light blue histogram. And then over here, we have the two plans actually proposed by the North Carolina Republicans. And this is a plan proposed by a neutral panel of judges. So what does that tell you? The plan of the judges is right there in the center of the histogram, right? I mean, there are some plans which are better for Democrats and some are worse, but it's clearly been done neutrally. And the plans proposed by the Republicans are way, way at the end, where there are no neutral plans at all. I think pictures like this can convince the court. I hope. And then here's the one for Wisconsin. This one is oriented differently, so this is how many seats Republicans won. And again, there's the histogram. They made many, many random plans. And the numbers on top are the number of seats, which is also the percentage, because there's 99 seats in the Wisconsin Senate. So you see that the mode of the histogram, so the most likely number of seats won is 55. If you recall, Republicans got less than the majority of the votes in Wisconsin. And people are complaining that how is it that they got less than the majority, but they won more than half the seats? Well, in fact, under a random plan, they would win more than half the seats. They would win 55 seats out of 100, out of 99. But they wouldn't win 60-something, right? So basically, this tells you how to differentiate the demographic advantage. The demographic advantage is what gives them 55 and not 49. But the rest of it is gerrymandering. So what else are we doing? We are running workshops around the country to train people to be expert witnesses in cases like this, to train teachers to teach this kind of thing in their classroom, which is good both for math education because the kids are sort of, find this interesting, and it's good for civics education. We're running hackathons to build open source districting software so that people can actually, when redistricting time comes, propose their own plans, which are great ways to show, look, a middle school teacher drew up this plan, which is so much better and so much fairer on every level than the legislature's plan. That's kind of a good way to hold politicians to the fire. And building, as I said before, a community of people who are ready to go and sort of know all this stuff and ready to tackle it in 2021. So we are holding a series of workshops. Unfortunately, the Boston one has already happened. But if you happen to be in Madison, Durham, Austin, or San Francisco at any of those times, please come to our workshops. They are sort of mathy and technically oriented, but they're not just for math people. And if you want more information about our work or want to support our project, there's our website, sites.tufts.edu, and then gerrymander without the E before the R. So thank you. Happy to take questions. Yeah. Oh, so is there a particular way? Yeah, okay, so. Yes.
First thing, thank you very much. That was very enlightening. It was a lot of stuff, I'll have to admit, went over my head, but I know some things I need to go back and look at. And I really like the concept of the random plans. Once again, it's not totally soaking in, but I think a few more rounds and I'll get there. But where I struggle with a little bit on maybe what you talked about or just in the general process, and the question isn't formulated right, but there are thoughts. And the three thoughts were, we talked about like communities and that being fairness, and I get that. And I get that you want representatives like that. But in today's political situation, one of the problems we have is that we have everybody going to Congress working with their constituencies, and we don't have people working across the line because they go back and they are working with that. So how we define this, what are our goals? Is our goal to maybe have a better integrated America? And maybe like communities may or may not be it. And I just want to throw these thoughts out and get your thoughts is what I'm doing. And then the last, so it was like communities, it was the fact that we have, our constituents are all going back to the people that are just like them versus working across the aisle. And the third point was, we're talking as if society is Republicans and Democrats. And there's actually, what happens when you have a third party? Or because I think that a lot of more people are becoming more independent versus Republican and Democrat. Don't know if those three things you can help walk me through it at an extra level, but that's what I'd like to hear your thoughts on.
Sure. There's a lot to unpack there, and those are all really, really good points. So let me think how I want to start. So first of all, let me say that the Constitution and the whole American form of government was conceived by the Founding Fathers without reference to political parties. They were very, very much hoping that political parties would not form. They thought political parties were evil. And even as they kept saying this, they also were forming their own political parties. Political parties seem to be unavoidable in democracies, but one of the problems of our systems is that it's not geared for political parties, right? Europe, most European elections, you vote for a party, like it's rigged into the system, and proportional representation is like written into the system. Whereas for us, you're supposed to be just voting from a person from your district who you respect and who think represents your interest. Yeah, right. Right? That's not actually how it's been working. And so, so one thing you say is, yes, you want to represent communities, but don't we want more conversation across the aisle? So one thing one might say, is that in an age of such partisanship, the model of geographic representation, where you just choose an outstanding member of your community to represent you, is not valid, doesn't work anymore. And so there is actually people who are working to propose different modes in Congress where you don't have single member districts anymore. You have larger districts with proportional representation within the districts. And you could take this to an extreme and say this would totally be okay with the Constitution, where each state votes for all of its representatives as a whole and then assigns them proportionally to parties, right? And that would decrease, that would erase gerrymandering completely. It would also assure more proportional representation rather than these funny curves, right? Which is what most people seem to want. So I take your point that that sort of representing geographic communities might not be the thing you want to do, but in that case, you should just stop doing geographic-based representation, which is fine. It's not actually in the Constitution. So that might be something to struggle for. Another really important thing that you said is that we have to decide what our goals are. That is really, really important. And I hope what I conveyed here is that there's clear sort of mathematical unfairness, like if those curves are not symmetric, that's mathematically unfair. And then there's sort of people's ideas of fairness, which aren't mathematically right or wrong. They're just not right or wrong. Those are values. And we need to decide our values. And one of the most important places where we need to decide our values, which I think is specifically for people who are fighting to end gerrymandering at the state level, often, like many states now, are going to have ballot initiatives that say, we're going to have a nonpartisan redistricting commission, and it will do redistricting the following way. And for many of those, I think they actually face a big choice. They have to say, do we want redistricting done neutrally, as in don't look at partisan information at all, in which case you will get Republican advantage in most places because of the demographic bias, or do we want redistricting done fairly according to some definition of partisan fairness, where you actually look at the partisan distribution and you try to achieve some particular goal. Those are, neither of them is better. Those are, neither of them is wrong. Those are values that we need to decide what we want. And then the third value we could have is just like abandon this whole redistricting thing altogether. That's outdated, which is kind of like what you were saying. So those are decisions we need to make. And with all the focus on the Supreme Court, it's important to remember that all the Supreme Court can do in this case that's coming up in a week is curb the very, very worst forms of gerrymandering. It's not going to solve any of the other problems. And so the right way to go is for states to make laws, or maybe for Congress, but good luck with that. But states, especially states with ballot initiatives, and some states have done this, we can make the laws that we want to make, and we have to choose our values. As for the last thing you said about independence, so all the work on gerrymandering is really focused on the two-party system because that's complicated enough. Our general electoral system of plurality tends to discourage independence. So independents come and go, but generally America has two parties. Independents are short-term phenomena. Proportional representations, such as in Europe, naturally lead to more than two parties. And again, this is a value thing. Like we need to decide, is this what we want or is that what we want? And then we can adjust our electoral system accordingly. And there's actually a whole branch of mathematics called voting theory that deals with how do you design electoral systems. It's actually extremely complicated and extremely interesting, but how you design an electoral system will affect the kinds of representation you have, the number of parties you'll have, as this sort of naturally arises. So a lot of this is, I've been talking about sort of objective facts like math, but a lot of this is actually values, and the math only serves to tell you if these are your values, this is what you should do, and this is what you can expect to happen, and this is what you can't expect to happen. Yeah.
So I spent a while doing modeling in my life, and one
Doing
thing, I spent a lot of time doing modeling in my life, and equations are nice and all, but the inputs to it and the assumptions the first choice is the data you're going to use, the quality of the data,
Yep.
the error terms, et cetera. So you've chosen to use, for instance, one of those graphs, population density as a measure, and not square miles.
Right.
Something about population count. The question, I think, is very valid that we really don't have two parties. It's not a binary decision. And also looking at just one voter density, Republican versus non-Republican, doesn't include the other votes that also skew the results. So how do you, present, you present something that looks like this is a simple model, but really the drivers behind the model are much more complicated, as you confessed earlier, and that if we had 3 parties or 4 parties, even if they were minor, that could be enough to push the results of your model in a different direction. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Sort of. I mean, I absolutely agree that the quality of the data matters a lot, and wait, leave him with the mic because I want to ask him a question for a second. And that model assumptions are very important. But I'm wondering what exactly, is there a particular aspect of what I was saying that you're challenging that I can reply to? So for example, like the thing about population density, that actually didn't go into any of the models. That was just to display it so you can see it. That wasn't actually fed into anything. So is there a particular concern that you have that the data are skewing something in some particular way?
Yeah, I mean, if you used all actual votes, different parties, independents, and also voting in terms of the Green Party or whatever, how that could skew the difference. If you're looking at Vermont, or if you're looking at Massachusetts, and also there's a time dynamic in Massachusetts. So you look at the counties now. I think Wellesley is part of Lowell. We're in the same thing, or we were Fall River or something at one point. It winds way down in the
So is the thing that you're challenging my assertion
Or
that
voting.
that Massachusetts congressional districts aren't gerrymandered and that you couldn't have a Republican district? I'm not.
I guess I'm just wondering how the model, the results of your model are determined by the data you choose.
So,
And the data you're choosing, I think, may not have.
So there's a
enough.
lot of problems with the data, right? For example, unopposed, uncontested districts where you actually just don't know how people would have voted. So then you make a mathematical model of how they would have voted by looking at, how they voted for the president and comparing how in other districts presidential vote compares to the vote for the House and sort of inferring it from there. So a lot of this work, it's true that behind it, there's not straight data, there's modeling. I'm not sure that not counting independents, you can do that in one of many ways. For example, you could say Republican and everyone else, or you can say, like, just look at the Republican and Democrats and ignore the rest, or you can sort of say, well, like group, let's say, Nader and Gore together or something like that. Any way you do it, the results come out about the same. So I'm just trying to think of which assertions I made that would be different if you looked at the data differently. But let's just, maybe we'll talk about it later, but I want to say something about data actually. So the kinds of data that go into this are, first of all, demographic data. So just where the people are, race, age, whatever. those data are available from the census. They're very well sort of gathered, understood. They're neutral. You know, now we have the Census 2020 coming up. The Census Bureau is underfunded. People are all worried about all sorts of things. But at least, okay, let's say that's okay. Partisan data, election results, are actually extremely hard to come by, it turns out. We know who won every election. But what you need for this work is not just the total of number of people who voted for, I don't know, Bush in Massachusetts, but exactly where they were. And those precincts level results are often very hard to get. And you also need the precinct maps, which are often not even kept. So there's a lot of like people who work on gathering these data tell me that like they call up county offices and the best data they can get for where the precincts were was a picture of a wall that was hanging on a map 5 years ago in that office. Like that's the level. And the problem is that there are big organizations, both on the left and on the right, who go and do a lot of work to gather these data and then sell them for hundreds of thousands of dollars to the parties. Whereas us, the sort of the regular citizen, can't get access to it. So one of the things we're working on with an organization called the Public Mapping Project, which is trying to create software to enable citizens to do redistricting on their own, but also to get all these data so that we can see what the alternatives are. Even to run those districting simulations, the sampling things, you need data. And for some states they have it, and for some states it's just really hard to get. So data is a huge, huge issue here as always. I haven't seen a place in this work, and I think very critically about data also as a mathematician, where like if you did the data one way you would get one thing, and if you did the data another way you would get a totally different thing. So I personally haven't seen it, but that's a concern that I have too, that I always am thinking about. So more questions?
There are 100 million people eligible that didn't vote. In Massachusetts, 40%, over 40% identified themselves as independent. Neither party claims more than 28%. It seems that, even within the Republican or Democratic Party, there are factions that are heavily influenced by Citizens United, for instance, that these are factors. North Carolina did not get their AAA Democratic rating from international organizations when they look at the way they divided up, or the Jim Crow across the country. Can you speak to these effects on your data and on your model?
So I think that there's a bunch of things, right? So the thing in North Carolina, the sort of vote denial, and the court said that they targeted, African American neighborhoods with almost surgical precision with the voter ID laws and all that. That is horrible and doesn't have that much to do with any of this. Like, that's sort of a separate issue. The fact that there are a lot of independents, so I see this coming up all the, like, you guys keep every question so far has been like, well, there aren't just Republicans and Democrats, there's also other people. I guess, let's say this way. If you're a legislator and you're trying to gerrymander, you pretty much are thinking, you don't care about the independents, they're not going to win. So you're thinking about the Republicans and the Democrats, whichever party you are, you're thinking about that, and you're trying to create your plan in such a way to advantage your party and disadvantage the other party. Which means that I, as a person trying to fight you, and you the gerrymanderer, right, and figure out ways to detect what you're doing and to measure what you're doing, mostly need to focus on that too. In other words, I'm focusing on the two-party system because that is the current problem, right? The current problem is that one party is trying to disadvantage the other. of course, you can say the broader problem is that neither parties are actually, serving the needs of the voters, whatever, or that independents are squeezed out. But that's not the gerrymandering problem. That's a different problem. I'm hoping I'm answering your question. I'm not sure I completely understood exactly what the question was. But so the fact that
Follow up to the model, it just doesn't incorporate the factors that are involved, the money that's involved, the Koch brothers with $189 million involved.
so all of that.
And their organizations that are neither Democrat nor Republican, but that are PACs that are influencing the system and that are influencing the districts that are
So again, those organizations certainly influence the system a lot, but the way they affect gerrymandering is, by causing, well, one way they affect gerrymandering actually, one reason that gerrymandering has gotten worse, one clear reason gerrymandering has gotten worse is improved technology for the gerrymanderers. The other one is that the country is more polarized, and so it's easier to predict how you will vote. In other words, it used to be that people switched. But now, if you voted Democratic for the last 3 elections, there's a good chance you're just a lifelong Democrat and you're never going to switch no matter what happens, right? And so that polarization makes gerrymandering easier. It also makes catching gerrymandering easier in some sense because we can now model people as simply Democrats or Republicans and not anything else. And that model is incorrect, obviously, like most models, but it is a better model now than it used to be, unfortunately, right? Because people are so polarized and hyper-partisan. So the way independents fit into all these models is in the variation. So the overall model that political scientists use of sort of the United States electoral landscape is the following, that there are places which are more Democratic and places which are more Republican. So you can kind of think of a landscape like over here there's Democrats, and over here there's Republicans. And then this whole landscape moves up and down essentially uniformly so that it's not like Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Texas are ever going to switch. Cambridge will always be more Democratic than Texas, but in every election, as the country swings more Republican, everybody gets more Republican. And that is where the independents come in because they're the ones who are changing, right? So that is not a correct model, right? Because I come from Cambridge, Massachusetts. There's nothing that's going to swing it more Republican, right? Like the whole country will move down and Cambridge will stay right here. But it's not a bad model. It's actually, it's not a perfect model, but it seems to be a pretty good model at functioning how things work. And that swing is where the independents are. So that, I think, is how they're captured in the model. Yeah.
Thank you. I was interested in the efficiency gap. I understand that you aren't a fan in the use of it, so I was interested to know who came up with it, and if it is as flawed as you feel. I have to go read about it.
Yeah.
Why has it risen to the level of being potentially the standard that the court is being asked to look at?
That's a really good question. So the people who came up with it, their names are Nick Stephanopoulos, who is a legal scholar at the law school in Chicago, and Eric McGee, who's a political scientist. And they were, so there's kind of a whole cottage industry of studying the writings of Anthony Kennedy like a holy writ. Because Anthony Kennedy is our swing justice, and he's going to decide this case. Like the fact that anybody else has any say on the matter is a fiction. The 4 justices on the left will say yes, the 4 justices on the right will say no. He's going to decide the case. So they were studying very carefully like what exactly he wanted. It's kind of, yeah, it's a strange situation, right? And they claim that sort of this is what came up with in response to that. Why this? So it's basically very unstatistical. It's a very kind of, you just measure some numbers and you add and subtract and you get a number. It doesn't require statistical modeling. Now, it only pretends not to require statistical modeling. Actually, if you dig into it It requires tons of statistical modeling because, for example, uncontested elections still exist and you still have to impute what they would do. And there's lots, like you have to do sensitivity analyses, there's lots of stuff. But if you just describe it on the level of a newspaper article, it sounds really, really simple. And I think, I don't actually know the story very well, but I think once they had this, they were looking for a case to bring and a court that would be sympathetic that might work out. And they succeeded, and other people, I think, didn't. But they looked to Wisconsin because I think they knew that the judges might be sympathetic. And the case itself was so egregious. I mean, the gerrymandering in Wisconsin is egregious. Like, there's just no question that it's really bad. The funny thing is that nobody doubts that, right? Like, everybody's like, oh, we need a good measure of gerrymandering. But everybody knows that the gerrymandering in Wisconsin is egregious. And we might disagree about Massachusetts, but Wisconsin is not in question. And then I think people kind of jumped on the bandwagon because they're really hopeful that the Supreme Court will do something. But if you actually look at what the judges said, and if you look at all the amicus briefs that are being submitted to the Supreme Court, they're all kind of saying, yeah, the efficiency gap is nice, but actually we have other measures. We're not putting all our eggs in that basket because it's really simplistic.
I think we need to thank Mira now. And if you still have a question for Mira, maybe she'd be willing to be around for a few minutes. And thank you very, very much for coming to be with us this evening. It was very interesting.
Thank you.